So you don't really need to read most. This is also slightly old information, but on average, according to this 2016 graph, it's about 300 gallons of water per day per family. Now, take that into consideration, and oh, you've got to be kidding me. Fine. Let's do it this way. Just a moment, my UI is making some problems for me. So this is a nice Vox article from last year talking about the water crisis in the United States, specifically in the West. Las Vegas, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, California. We all know that these places are drought-ridden. But why is a good question to ask. So, as you can see, mega droughts, etc., etc., this is all stuff that we know. Now, these graphs here are what I really wanted to talk about from this article. So, the Colorado River, which, for some context, let's pull up a little map. The Colorado River runs all the way up from Lake Mead down tributaries of this. I see Colorado River Reservation, move down, 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 all the way to California. Tributaries move down to Arizona. This is a major river, and this river is used to power quite a lot of things. Thermoelectric power, 67,000 million gallons of water. And is this per year? Yes, I would imagine that this is... Sure. Estimated from the Colorado River Basin, including only uses within the basin and do not include water exports from the basin, reservoir evaporation, or natural losses. So, thermoelectric power, little slice here, commercial and industrial. Now this is stuff like steel mills, which use water to cool metal, etc., stuff like that. Water is used in the creation of plastics, many things. Domestic and public supplies, this is your drinking water, your tap water, your shower water, stuff you use to do laundry, wash dishes, water your lawn, etc. And this little slice of other. But then you can see the rest of this giant pie is crop irrigation. Now, crop irrigation does not mean food production that ends up on the grocery store shelves. This is crop irrigation primarily growing things like alfalfa, hay, corn, and other grasses used to feed beef, cows, and dairy cows. Some of the other crops, like soy, grain, corn, wheat, barley, and even cotton, may also be used for animal feed. So much of this graph, this 327 million gallons of water is used to grow food, not for us to eat, but for us to feed to animals that we then go on to eat. Now, most of this, 79% of the river's water, goes to crop irrigation, and this is what each crop receives. Now, alfalfa, grasses, and corn silage for livestock feed accounts for almost 75% of all of this water use. The rest of it goes to corn, grain, wheat, rice, soy, almonds, potatoes, and cotton. Much of this we do get to eat. Much of this still is used to feed animals in the large-scale farming operations that exist around the Colorado River. Now, meat production is pretty bad. We know this. This is not necessarily surprising news. But what I wanted to talk about specifically in relation to this, the rest of this article is very interesting, but before we get to that, there's a lot of blame sharing that goes around in regards to environmentalism and climate change and stuff like that. So corporations really, really love to make us as consumers feel guilty about the things that we do and how we impact the environment. Things like plastic utensils and straw bans and plastic bags, and all of these little things are good. We should move away from using plastic bags every day. We should move away from using plastic utensils. But none of these things contribute even remotely close to as much to the actual problems as the industries that don't get any attention do. And this blurs the accountability, as the vast majority of pollution, the vast majority of carbon that ends up in the air that is harmful to the environment does not come from us. It comes from major corporations. The blurring of accountability. How much do we actually contribute to pollution, to environmental degradation, to climate change? Not a small amount. We, as a collective species, do produce a lot of waste, and cutting down on that is important and is very good. Taking shorter showers, not having grass lawns, that's all great. Not using plastic bags, using reusables when you go grocery shopping. All of this is wonderful, but it's really just a drop in the bucket. And the average citizen shouldn't need to shoulder the burden of fixing the issue of climate change on their own, especially while massive industries continue to push for more and more deregulation so they can pollute even more. We saw this under the Trump administration with the weakening of the EPA, and we don't even know the extent to which the damage caused by that continues. And yes, some of those environmental regulations have returned under the Biden administration, but not all of them. And many more regulations have been cut and will continue to be, as this is the whole point of corporate lobbying and government. They work for their gain. And so water waste in general touches on quite a few different industries, I would say. Energy production. We use water to produce energy, and this is important. Hydroelectric dams are environmentally friendly, but they do account for some usage of clean water. Industrial uses, also important. We need to make things for people to use. We do live in a modern society, and a lot of things require water to make them. And of course, personal use in agriculture. The issue isn't with water being used for these means. It's the lack of care in how it's used. It's the stupidity of growing things like almonds in arid California. It goes back to a point that I made in my previous stream about Australia selling water rights to private investors so they could speculate on water like it's a stock and sell it for a profit. It's things like this that don't get the same amount of attention as the plastic bag bans and the straws and grass lawns do. As much as all of those things do matter, these things also do, and we need to pay attention to that. Now, going back to this Vox article, California takes more water from the Colorado River than any other state, and most of it goes to the Imperial Valley in the southern part of the state. It's one of the most productive agricultural regions in the U.S., producing 2/3 of America's vegetables during winter months. But the majority of the Imperial Valley's farmland is dedicated to alfalfa and various grasses for livestock. In Arizona, Phoenix's backup water supply is being drained to grow alfalfa by a Saudi-owned dairy company, which ships the alfalfa 8,000 miles back to the Middle East to feed its domestic herds. Why are we depleting the backup water supply of Arizona, of Phoenix in Arizona, to feed Saudi cows? Why, if not for profit? And who profits in this case? If a Saudi dairy company is purchasing water rights to grow alfalfa, land and water rights in Arizona to grow alfalfa, which it then ships 8,000 miles back to Saudi Arabia for it to feed its own dairy cows, because Saudi Arabia has banned growing alfalfa. Who is the one profiting here? Well, for one, it's the Saudi corporation, because they get to grow the feed for their animals and then sell the produce that comes from those. These are dairy cows, so they produce milk and cheese. But who in the U.S. is profiting from this? The state, I suppose, who is renting the land and selling the water rights, but how does the state actually benefit from this? Where is this water going? Is it decreasing the tax burden of those who live in Arizona? Is it making food cheaper in Arizona? No, it's not. This is just blatant corruption. This Middle Eastern company, this Saudi company works with this other company. They give some donations to a political candidate. Bam. It's obscene. So, we all know how droughts work. We don't need to explain that. Why are there so many water-guzzling farms in the desert? Now, the executive director for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation was asked this question, and the answer that he gave was, I don't think a farmer would design it this way. Now, this goes back quite a bit to the Homestead Act, the Reclamation Act. All of these things are important, but we're not going to get into that today. I don't really care all that much about why and how this system came to be. The answer is just profit-seeking and corruption. What I want to talk about is adapting to climate change includes changing what we eat. A number of short-term solutions should be enough to help the Colorado River states get through the next few years. But in the long term, policymakers and food producers, and us, the consumers, need to think about what we're going to do. This current system is not sustainable. This means that altering the demand side of the water supply shifts the diets globally of food to use less water, which ultimately means less meat and dairy. Fewer water-intense tree nuts like almonds, pistachios, and cashews, and much less water to produce than nut milks, however, require much less water to produce than cow's milk. Sure, doesn't matter. Our entire system of how we produce food is not sustainable, especially as climate change ramps up. It's going to be difficult to allocate this much water. So what's the plan? What are we going to do? What can we do about something like this? Now, the federal government, through deregulation, R&D investments, and subsidies, and food purchasing, like for public schools and federal cafeteria, heavily favors animal agriculture. Now, key word here is deregulation. Given the meat and dairy lobby's political influence, the farm states are overrepresented in the Senate. Drastic changes to the food supply in the near term, ones that would favor plant-based agriculture, are out of the realm of political possibility. Now, made my point for me right there. It's corruption, lobbying. We know that dairy farmers and just general cattle farmers have a massive impact on our political infrastructure and have for years. I'm sure you've all heard of the meme of government cheese sitting in caves all over the country. That's not just a meme. There is cheese sitting in caves all over the country because we subsidize dairy farmers so that they wouldn't go out of business back when they needed it. But we never stopped necessarily. Sure, we've cut down on those subsidies now, but we have cut almost all regulations regarding the amount of resources that they're allowed to use. The deregulation of the food industry is the point that I want to make here. Study finds little difference between plastic and seafood, meat, and plant-based proteins. It's all contaminated. The contamination of our food is incredibly important, and it ties in to the contamination of the environment around our food. Now, before we get to that, I do want to make clear that the reason that there is this much contamination in our food goes back to the deregulation of these food industries, to the lobbying power that they hold, to the amount of money that they spend every year donating to political campaigns, buying politicians gifts, and threatening to pull investment and move their operations to different states, which would affect the jobs of people living in this state. So this politician now has to bend over backwards for this company so that they don't lose their business. And it's just all a race to the bottom. It doesn't result in anything good except for profits for said company, and it harms all of us in the long term. It makes our food inedible because 90% of it now has plastic in it. Now, back to water. Foodprints.org, how industrial agriculture affects our water. Now, what are the sources of water pollution from agriculture? Industrial animal agriculture, concentrated animal feeding operations, known as CAFOs, are also known as factory farms, typically house thousands of animals, generating millions, if not billions, of gallons of animal waste per year. For example, North Carolina alone generates almost 10 billion gallons of animal waste per year. Now, speaking of North Carolina, I want to show you this picture. This is a picture of the water surrounding a feedlot for pigs. The article that this comes from will be linked in the source video. It's another Vox article, just like this. It's from a few years ago, showing that the contamination of the water supply in North Carolina, the vast majority of the rivers, of the streams, of the lakes, are not safe drinking water because of the pollution from these pig farms. Most of the pork in the United States is grown in parts of North Carolina. And this brown water is just pig shit. It's just contaminated with pig shit and everything that's in it. And this is a large chunk of the fresh water available in North Carolina. Now, animal waste is either stored in pits or open ponds called lagoons. Water waste areas often leak during storms, can rupture. To dispose of the waste, they spray this manure onto farm fields. The environmental damage from spraying these and the leaking is genuinely devastating. Animal waste can include pharmaceutical residues, heavy metals like copper and zinc, harmful bacteria which can leach into the water supply. Chicken manure is especially high in phosphorus. Now, again, these are all naturally occurring like chemicals and elements, and they're in much of the things that we eat. But when it gets put into the water supply and spreads outward, it affects much more than just you or the people around that area on a micro level. It has a macro impact. Some of these are nutrients. Nitrogen and phosphorus are two of the main macronutrients in fertilizer that promote plant growth. Synthetic fertilizers containing both nitrogen and phosphorus are applied imprecisely to farm fields, often at rates far higher than what the plant needs or what the soil can absorb. The excess nutrients from fertilizers leach into the surface and the groundwater, causing algal blooms, nitrate contamination, impacting drinking water, recreational activities such as swimming and boating, fishing, shellfishing, and marine aquatic life. It's not about what you're using, it's about how you're using it. And these corporations are not regulated well enough to have to be careful in how they use it. Algal blooms, dead zones, and acidification. Harmful algal blooms occur when aquatic algae grows rapidly and out of control. Some of these produce biotoxins, which kill fish and other aquatic life, cause human illnesses. Others use up oxygen in the water, producing dead zones where aquatic creatures cannot live. Nitrogen fertilizers applied in farm fields in the Midwest eventually make its way down to the Gulf of Mexico. This, along with runoff from animal waste, is one of the leading causes for the so-called Gulf Dead Zone, an oxygen-deprived area that spans more than 8,000 square miles in some years, in which no fish can survive. In places like the eastern shore of Maryland, home to thousands of chicken broiler houses, rivers have phosphorus concentrations that are among the highest in the nation, which is linked to an estimated 290,000 tons of excess chicken waste spread in the state. The Chesapeake Bay, which receives runoff from many of these chicken houses, experiences regular toxic algae blooms and dead zones. Ammonia from agricultural runoff degrades the ecosystem, acidifying waterways. Heavy metal contaminations. Excessive amounts of heavy metals like copper and zinc are fed as supplements to pigs and chickens to promote growth and prevent disease. Other metals in animal waste can include cadmium, lead, mercury, and arsenic. Cadmium, lead, mercury, and arsenic are some of the chemicals that are in the water supply. Not chemicals, some of the elements and heavy metals. Cadmium is radioactive. I'm almost positive. I'm gonna look that up right now. Cadmium radioactive. Some cadmium is radioactive, sure. Lead, mercury, and arsenic. You remember Flint, Michigan, with the lead in the water supply, getting people sick? We all know mercury gets you sick. Mercury, don't drink from the thermometer was a thing back before digital thermometers. Arsenic, these are things that should not be in the water supply. It's ridiculous to have to say that. But these corporations are not regulated to the point where they have to care. They can just do that. They can just allow this to happen when it's not all that difficult to stop this. I'm not, the production isn't the problem when we're talking about contamination of the water supply. When we're talking about use of the water, yes, the production and how much it's produced is a problem. But when we're talking about the contamination of water because of agricultural production, solving this issue is not difficult. We could see where they were talking up here about the lagoons that most of the waste is stored in, which leak during storms and can rupture. Regulations that require these farms to create more solid ways to store this waste is not difficult. It would just cost the corporation a bit of money to have regulations that prevent them from spraying excessively the nutrients that are useful for crop fertilizer to the amount where it's far more than what the crop needs, to build infrastructure to prevent runoff that creates dead zones and toxic algae blooms. These are not difficult issues to fix. They just cost money. And while the EPA itself says that nitrate levels above 3 milligrams per liter of water indicate contamination, and levels above 1 milligram per liter indicate contamination due to human activity, the EPA sets nitrate contamination standards at 10 milligrams per liter to prevent blue baby syndrome, which is low oxygen levels in infants caused by elevated nitrate levels in drinking water. Now let me read this again. The EPA says that levels above 3 milligrams per liter indicate contamination. Levels above 1 milligram per liter indicate contamination due to human activity. But the standard for nitrate contamination is at 10 milligrams per liter. In a survey of state nitrate groundwater pollution indicated as greater than 5 milligrams per liter, 53% of Delaware's groundwater was polluted with greater than 5 milligrams per liter of nitrates, as well as 28% of Maryland's, 10% of California's. Each of these states have large numbers of factory farms. Chemical pollution of drinking water from agriculture is a problem. As many as 1 million Californians, for example, mostly living in farming communities in the Central Valley, have dangerous levels of unregulated chemicals linked to cancer in their drinking water, according to the California State Water Board. Why? Why is this allowed? I keep asking why, but we all know what the answer is. It's lobbying, it's corporate interest, it's money, it's profit. And we haven't even gotten to pathogen contamination and disease breakouts. Swine waste, for example, can contain more than 100 pathogens that can cause human diseases. Remember that picture of pig shit water that I showed you? not even like 10 minutes ago in North Carolina. When factory farm lagoons leak, contaminated water can end up in waterways and groundwater. Pathogens can survive after being sprayed onto farm fields, leaching into groundwater, or being transported to the surface due to water runoff. People can become sick simply by ingesting water during recreational activities, like swimming in a lake that's contaminated, or just being on a boat and having some water splash in your face. It's obscene that this is allowed. It's obscene that the federal regulations regarding this are so weak. And continue to be weakened to this day, mind you. It's not that they're just weak. It's that they've been weak. How do we fix this problem? Regulate the industries. How do we regulate the industries? We make them stop doing this shit. It's really that simple. We make them create infrastructure to stop runoff. We regulate how much they can spray onto plants. And it's not rocket science we're talking about here. It's common sense regulation, which is a term that gets thrown around sometimes and no one really knows what it means, but this is what it means. This is common sense regulation. Why are we allowing the pollution of our water? None of this needs to happen, and all of this is quite easy to fix. It's ridiculous that we haven't done anything about it. The original Environmental Protection Agency ruled addressing CAFO waste under the Clean Water Act was finalized in 2003. This rule regulated all factory farms as point source polluters or identifiable source polluters. Let's find out what that exactly means. Point source pollution is a single identifiable source of air, water, thermal, light pollution. A point source has negligible extent, distinguishing it from other sources. Sure. And an identifiable source of pollution is the EPA defines point source pollution as any single identifiable source of pollution from which pollutants are discharged, such as pipe, ditch, ship, factory smokestacks, etc. Cool. All CAFOs were required to apply for a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit under the presumption that CAFOs have a potential to discharge pollutants into waterways. The permit limits what can be discharged, sets acceptable levels for pollutants, permitted levels for bacteria, and specifies monitoring and reporting requirements. Now, this is good. It's weak, but it is good. The original rule has since been updated several times because of lawsuits, most recently from the National Pork Producers Council. The rule now states that only large operations that discharge manure directly into waterways are required to obtain the federal permit. Now, what is a large operation defined as by the EPA? And only ones that discharge manure directly into waterways discounts the vast majority of pollution. It's not just about directly discharging the waste into waterways, which they also do, and facilities that plan to manage waste in lagoons and dispose of it by spreading it or spraying it on cropland need no permit at all. None. So from 2003 to this article was published in February of this year. We have gotten rid of any need for them to register for a permit. Like that easy. This despite the reality of leaks, spills, and runoffs from such facilities. Pollutant-filled water that runs off during rain or due to over-application falls into the category of agricultural stormwater, which is regulated as a non-point source and does not require a permit. In 2023, however, the EPA agreed to revisit regulatory policies for its CAFOs after facing pressure from advocacy groups. This, along with federal court rulings, that would reinstate the need for CAPOs to get permits if they want access to federal loans, could be the beginning of a proactive federal policy. Good. Good. I hope that the EPA does revisit this, and we do reintroduce that already weak system back in, so that they at least have some regulations on them. Even if the EPA did reintroduce these regulations, there would be more lawsuits. These lawsuits would go up to the conservative Supreme Court, which you never know what they're going to do. They have no accountability. They just do whatever the hell they want because we decided that a bunch of people in robes in a dark room that cameras can't enter can change the entirety of US law just on a whim. And again, this is not counting in the fact that Congress will not pass these regulations. It has to be the EPA passes them themselves. And then, let's say the lawsuits fail, then these corporations lobby congressmen and senators to pass laws that override these regulations. This does not account for the fact that Trump might get back into power this year, and he originally devastated EPA regulations in general. It's an incredibly risky situation involving incredibly sensitive. It's an incredibly sensitive topic because it affects the lives of millions. It affects our drinking water and our food supply, which is very much disgustingly contaminated with chemicals, metals, bacteria, and plastic. And the regulations that are being fought for at this very moment don't even touch 3/4 of the problem. They don't even, the regulations that existed prior to this, the ones that we had put in place in 2003, only limit a certain amount of what can be discharged. The whole situation is just filled with conflicting interests from the industry side versus the consumer side, with the regulatory agency in the middle having very, 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 very minuscule power to do anything about the issue. In recent years, lax regulations and government action about water pollution from CAPOs has meant locals are increasingly using lawsuits to act to protect local waterways and drinking water. Good. However, local and state lawmakers, often working with big meat companies, quote unquote, have countered this movement by passing laws that make it easier for CAPOs and processors to operate in local communities even when there is community opposition. In many cases, as in North Carolina, CAPOs operate in poorer areas that are disproportionately inhabited by minorities. This has, in part, given rise to a robust environmental justice movement in these areas to fight against this pollution. Good and bad. This is a side tangent that I actually want to go on really quickly. Local and state elections are infinitely more important than the presidential election. These state lawmakers, these governors, the mayors of local cities, are much easier to buy by corporations. The price tag is much lower. And often, the industry leaders, the owners of these farms, live in these states and are friendly with the local state government officials. The easiest way to solve this problem is not to go from the top down, it's to go from the bottom up. Run for local office if you can. Kick these assholes out of their seats of power because they don't represent us. They don't represent you. If you live in North Carolina, you are not being represented by your state and local lawmakers. So get them out. Run yourself if you have the interest, if you're watching this video, you clearly do have the interest, and if you live in North Carolina, then run for state or local office. Do something. Run for your local council, at the very least. And fight for the right to have access to clean food and water. Fight for your local communities. If you live in these disproportionately poorer areas and you're a minority that's being affected by this lack of regulation, then join the environmental justice movements that are in your area. Go out and protest. As we've seen, protests are important, and they do matter. We saw it this week with the university protests. Every time they crack down on one, another one pops up. And yes, the crackdowns are horrible. And yes, it's bad for democracy. But protests function most efficiently when they're being cracked down on. Because now these protests have spread all across the world. There's protests in Germany, there's protests in England, there's protests in France, there's protests in Australia. We have the power to make the change. We don't have to rely on officials from the top doing it for us.